In this video, we're going to use some professional databases to teach various different lessons relevant to your discipline. So here we have a resource called Gapminder, and we're going to want to click on the Tools feature in Gapminder to end up with a kind of a four-dimensional database. So it's a database that also plots that data. So it's numeric data that can be graphed. And so it's kind of a merge between databases and spreadsheets. However, you're not really doing calculations. The calculations are already built into the spreadsheet, and you're just using it to graph. So let's say we wanted to ask some kind of a question. So here we have a graph of life expectancy versus income. So if I run this here, I take it back to the beginning. And I say, okay, from when we have the earliest data, about 1800, and again, the data is very suspect at this point here, but it's just estimates. We're going to look at the life expectancy here of various different countries as we go through time. And now you're going to see that these circles, the size of the circle is relevant to the size of the population. So that's got to be China. Sure enough, it is. This one's probably India. Okay, the two most populous countries for a long, long time. If we're trying to find where we are, we can look up here, and sure enough, that green one that's tracking around is going to be the United States. So we see that when you look at the trend, you could ask your students, okay, what do they notice and what do they wonder? All right, so they may have noticed over this time that the populations of all the countries were increasing. Okay, the bubbles initially were very small. Now that they're substantially larger, they may wonder why that is. They may also wonder why that the life expectancy tended to increase as time went on, and also how it tended to be correlated with income. So what we did is you saw the graph moving not only up, okay, so we saw it was low here. You also saw it moving right. So it was moving up in life expectancy and to the right in income. So in other words, people are living longer and income is getting greater. So you're asking the question, what's the correlation between life expectancy and income? You have to look at data over time. Now, again, there may be other factors going on here than just income. So we can look at other factors and so forth, but the way we can do that is by changing the variables. So if I want to look at life expectancy, maybe versus education. So I click at education and say maybe education is a better predictor. So I say literacy. And I want to say the literacy rate here total. Okay, so I can look at the total adult literacy rate. So now when you look at the data, you notice we have much fewer points because the data starts at 1975 because this data has not been collected. So if you look at this, we see a similar trend. We see that life expectancy increasing with literacy, but we have very little data. And the reason that dots appear is because after 1975, apparently countries start to report that as a vital document. You'll also notice when you go over here that there's many countries for which we don't have that data. We don't have it for Azerbaijan or Belarus and so forth, whereas we have estimates in terms of life expectancy. So you have to say, well, which is a better predictor? And maybe they're related. Maybe that population, I should say, maybe the literacy rate is related to income. So it starts to ask lots of different questions. And the idea for this exercise is to look at a database like that and say, okay, what can we use? Now, if you'll notice right here that up here, there's a teach feature. So there's goals for how to teach, all right? You can also see workshops and slide tests and test questions and so forth. So there's information. You'll be developing a lesson plan from a pre-prepared database. Gapminder is just one that you could use. You're free to choose whatever you'd like. But oftentimes, they're going to have resources like this that are specifically designed for teachers to help them develop lessons. If you're going to use pre-prepared material, make sure that you personalize it, make it your own, make it relevant to your own curriculum. I wanted to show you some other features on this right here. Right now, we're coloring the world regions. And so we can see we've colored the world regions and so forth right there. We could say, okay, how about if we want to do it not in terms of real regions, let's say landlocked countries. So now when we look at this, we've now looked at landlocked countries versus coastline countries. Does it make a difference that, if you're landlocked, and so countries like Nepal are surrounded by other countries. And so they have no access to the ocean. They have no access to transporting information. Obviously, something like India has a lot of access to the coast. And so we can see that that would provide information in terms of, does the ability to transport goods and so forth by the ocean make a difference? So you can choose what kind of parameters you want to in terms of, what kinds of parameters in terms of to set your parameters. I'm just going to go back up here and say, how about if I plot it by income groups? I'm going to go back here and choose, the default one here, which is well, I can't find the default one right now. Okay, so I'm going to change the color there and just leave it for right now. Okay, so that gives you an idea in terms of different ways you can plot the data. We're going to refresh the screen here again, just show you how we got to this. So I went to Gapminder.com, and when you go into Gapminder.com or Gapminder.org, you end up with this basic sheet here. You can again go to the tools, and from the tools, you're going to result in a kind of a baseline graphic. Let's say I'm interested in variables and changing the y-axis. And again, we can't consider these to be independent and dependent variables because we can't presume that the income is changing life expectancy, although we can kind of maybe presume that there's some relationship. They happen to be correlated, not necessarily causal. So let's say I want to look here at some other feature, let's say the environment, and I want to look for maybe emissions, okay? I want to see, well, how about the cumulative CO2 emissions? How much carbon dioxide are countries producing over time? Now, here, you're going to want to show the students that the graph has changed. The axis is now in a logarithmic when it comes to CO2 emissions because the span is so great. When we look at 1800, that countries that were the biggest producers, like United Kingdom and Germany, two of the more industrialized countries at that time. But this is prior to really the main part of the Industrial Revolution. And so we can see that these values up here in terms of carbon dioxide, they're at 100,000, cumulative tons. When you get up here, where the numbers grow here again, this becomes 1 billion, 10 billion, 100 billion, and so forth. So this is not a linear scale. So you're helping your students learn how to read the scale. So let's just watch this one right here. And this is cumulative CO2 emissions. And so we can see, wow, what happens in, all of a sudden 1850s, we start to see countries popping online. Again, it may just be for the introduction of data that we have on those countries, but everybody seems to be increasing fast. So we're increasing the carbon dioxide production, which of course is a key feature in terms of climate change. And we can start to see now a real huge issue in terms of, look at the bubbles and so forth here. The income of China is increasing dramatically. Also, it's CO2 emissions. So is there some kind of relationship between income and CO2? As we get wealthier, we have more labor-saving devices, more industry, and so forth. That may cause more environmental problems, and we're kind of seeing that with the United States and China and India and other big countries. Now, again, when you're doing this, I want you to look at all the different variables. You can click at this, and there are just an incredible number of variables. And you can change any of those variables you want to. And so you can also look for trends. You can see, we can map instead trends in the data. So if we wanted to go back and look at, here, this is going income adjusted and so forth over time. We can say, well, why were there huge drops? Why was there a huge drop in Russia around 1918? And then you ask you the question, well, what's going on in 1918? Obviously, that was a communist revolution. The country came to a standstill. Be interesting to see what happens if we could map, the world under COVID. Do we see a drop in terms of income? So you can graph this in many different ways. What you want to do is you want to explore with it. You can choose countries of interest. So like if I want to compare Algeria and Austria, then those are going to be thrown into the mix as well. So you choose the format. If you wanted to map everything and show the maps, where you actually plot the maps in the background. Once again, you can choose the data that you wish. It's up to you to develop a lesson, hopefully a lesson which is relevant to your instruction. Obviously, for social studies, it's pretty obvious. But there's also scientific things, as we talked about there, with climate change and industry, emissions and other environmental issues or energy-based issues. There's issues related to education, which it relates to all of us. So if you choose to use this database to develop a lesson, develop a lesson with some questions that engage your students in real true learning, where they're using this database, manipulating this database to ask some questions of relevance to your subject matter.